So welcome to Historical Literacy through Place-Based Learning. Today, we are going to be looking at history, literacy, and we're going to be using the question formulation technique, or the QFT. We're going to dive into how literacy skills are built through place-based explorations of history and get some practical experience using the QFT. And we're also going to ask a ton of questions. So be sure you have lots of questions ready because that's part of the joy of this. So one of the things that we are going to be doing today is using the question formulation technique, or the QFT. And everyone is going to have an experience of using it as a student, and then taking a step back and lifting the lid and looking at what was happening while we used the QFT. What were the strategies for learning and what are the connections to literacy? The QFT was developed by the Right Question Institute, and their program is widely regarded as a useful tool for engaging students with deeper learning and meaning making. And if you were to take it online, it's a fairly expensive course, but in addition to today, the Department of Education offers the full course free of charge to all Maine educators. And there will be more information about that at the end. So here we see a diagram of the types of student inquiry, and there are many different levels. And if you were to just start with free inquiry, it's a lot like tossing a kid in the deep end of the pool before they have learned how to swim. So we go backwards a little bit and we start with structured inquiry, and that's where we're going to be today. Students follow the lead of the teacher and the entire class engages in one inquiry together. So I would invite everyone right now to drop into the chat where you are and what your own level of comfort or experience is with student inquiry. And Sam is going to be monitoring the chat and we will pull things out of it. But do tell us a little bit about yourselves, where you are, where you're from, and how familiar you are with this. And if you've done the QFT course already, be sure to give a shout out on that so that we can all cheer about it. But by the end of today, you will all feel a level of comfort with the QFT. So good old Julia, this is my acknowledgement that today we are totally going to Julia Child this experience. If you were doing this work with your students in a classroom, you would spend significantly more time on the process. You would spend a lot of time discussing it and really pausing for reflection. The students would go out and find their own research with your help and your support and your guidance. But much like Julia, would pop one casserole into the oven and pull out a fully baked one. That's sort of what we're doing today. We're going to condense the question making process, and the resources are pre-baked and waiting for you. So the QFT smushed together on one slide. It is a very specific set of steps designed to promote student inquiry and questioning. And the process is really important because it gives a framework for students to work within. And there's something reassuring about having those boundaries. And it takes away some of the pressure of free association by giving some real guidance. So you start with a question focus. This might be an image, it might be a statement, it might be a random fact. The only thing that a question focus cannot be is another question, because questions tend to invite answers and we want to invite questions. So as long as it is not a question, you're good to go. From that, there's a time to produce the questions. And for this, it really is as many as you can in the amount of time that you're given. The rules are, you don't stop to ask questions, you don't stop to discuss or answer them, you record it exactly as it's stated, and if someone gives you a statement, you turn it into a question. So it's a real free-for-all brain dump of how many questions can we get in this given time frame, which is lovely because it eliminates the pressure of a good question and just puts the emphasis on a question. How many can you get? Then you're going to number them, and then you're going to work on improving them. You're going to categorize each question that you come up with as either closed or open-ended. And a quick definition is open-ended is the wide-ranging invites a longer answer. Closed can be answered with a simple yes or no or a one-word answer. And there are pros and cons to each, and we're going to discuss that when we get into it. Then you're going to have some practice of changing one closed question to an open and one open question back to a close, and we're going to share out. Then you're going to prioritize your questions. And for today, you're going to settle on one question from your list that you're going to do the research on. In a classroom, you might settle on 4 or 5 or all of them just in time sequence. You're going to come up with your action plan and discuss what is it you need to know and what is it you need to do in order to answer the question that you settled on. And then we're going to share out and we're going to reflect and we're going to see how our research combines. And then we're going to talk about the connections to literacy and foundational literacy skills that we were using throughout this process. I'm going to pause. Feel free to put in any clarifying questions into the chat, and we will make sure to carve some time to answer them. So right now, it is time to reveal the question focus, and there are two. We're going to be dividing into 2 groups for the question focus, and we're going to go into breakout rooms. The breakout rooms are not recorded, so that's a little bit different from the main room. And in our breakout rooms, we are going to be doing some deep research on the focus. All right, welcome back, everyone. Excited to see what folks have been coming up with. I've been hearing some of the conversation, and that's great. Before we go into the next phase, I kind of want to just take a moment to invite anyone to chime in with any reflections they have about the process so far.
Well, Heather, in our group, one of the things that I've noticed is, of course, we're working with restricted time. So as we generate, and we, when a few folks have, had some audio and they've issues or, tech issues, and I appreciate the flexibility of everybody today. But as we're talking about our questions, we're generating so many questions. And because you and I know kind of, quote, the answer to this inquiry, or what we hope to be the answer, is that having to kind of facilitate that discussion and kind of like, okay, let's lean into this question as a possible next step. And I can appreciate having the space with kids to be able to take them through that process through the long way. Like if we were, for our Q focus, it's about the Door and Champlain Mountains, and we've noticed the coloration difference between the greens. So we have a light green and a dark green. And it would be, in our next phase of this, it would be nice if we had the time and space to show like artifacts and objects and maps or whatnot, so we could continue to iterate and define and revise our question as we go. So I've noticed the time right now is a little bit of a limitation, of course, but we've had some really rich discussion in regards to the fact of open and closed questions and how they benefit both this inquiry for the purpose needed, and also how it's hard to get down and drill down to that question that we eventually will be researching. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In a classroom situation, you definitely would have the luxury of more time with your students to really explore all the little side roads of inquiry and all the places that the questions lead you. This is condensed for sure. So yeah, I appreciate that comment. And yeah, Julia Child to to the day. Anything else that folks want to share before we launch into the research portion, which is one of my favorite bits of the work? All right, well then, I am going to share and we are going to launch back in, and I'm going to pull up our research slide. This is where we start to dig in and answer the questions which we created. And now that we've settled on one, which is always, I think, the hardest part, tree group, do you want to share what the question is that you have decided to tackle?
We are going through what weather event could lead to two different colorations in the mountain.
All right, excellent. That's fantastic. Grand Hotel Group, do you want to share the question that you have decided to tackle?
We looked at did the hotel burn down in 1947? And we found a bunch of different things about it. We had to go backwards. We couldn't just start there. We had to go backwards and figure out a whole lot of pieces to get to the fire.
Oh, and you already dug in some. That's amazing. All right. So we are ready to go. So what I'm going to have each group think about is, what is the plan for answering your question? What is it that you need to know? And what is it you need to do? And as I say, if you were doing this in the classroom, they would really come up with the plan and they would figure out with your guidance where they need to go next. But we are Julia Childing it. So tree group, you are going to have a list of sources, and Grand Hotel Room, Grand Hotel Group, you are going to have a list of sources. And so Sam is going to send us all back into our breakout rooms. And Sam will be dropping these sources into the chat as well so that you can click on them really easily. Welcome back, everyone. I am going to take us back to our slides. So we had two groups doing deep dive research, which is fantastic. And I love how many did research on their own during the 10-minute break that we have. That like warms my little research heart right up. So we had the tree group and the Grand Hotel group. And I am going to invite the Grand Hotel group to start first with what they learned in their research.
We were looking at the Malvern Hotel in Bar Harbor and whether it burned in the 1947 fire. And we found out very quickly that it had burned in the fire, one of the five on the island that burned. It was interesting, though. We went laterally with a lot of our research, and a lot of the other things that were connected to the fire. We were looking at where, who had stayed there. We found a key from the hotel itself. We found a number of different things. We also found the color of the hotel, which was another question that we'd come up with earlier on. And it was very interesting to see, but that led to a broader discussion then about the fire of 1947 and Maine. And people within the group shared about family that had been involved in fighting the fire, or the fact that there were fires in other parts of the state other than just the Malvern Hotel in Bar Harbor. So it generated a lot of lateral questions, a lot of answers and discussions.
Yeah, I loved that. You guys came up with some really excellent other things to think about. Tim, did you want to share some of what you'd found in your research?
I did find out what the average thread count was on sheets in Grand Hotels. It was 80 or less, so kind of scratchy. I found the Malvern was on Kibo Street. It was part of Millionaires Row. So yeah, Gilded Age Hotel. It burned on the 23rd, and that entire area of town burned that day, except for not so much the business district. We got statewide statistics too, like overall in Maine in 1947, 200,000 acres were burned, 851 year-round homes, 397 seasonal homes were burned. And we found all sorts of cool artifacts. They've got a bunch of like napkins and silverware and china and stuff that were salvaged or stolen from the hotel at one point. So that was pretty cool to see.
Yeah, and collectively, you guys also found some really amazing stuff in the archives about what it meant when that happened. Do you want to expand upon some of that?
Yeah, we had, there were quite a bit of information about how the fire changed the character of Bar Harbor itself, how it went from being a extremely wealthy destination or vacation destination, primarily that, to it became more of a average person could go there. The the millionaires stopped necessarily flocking there. And also kind of interesting how the fire changed the ecological profile in that it burned so many of the coniferous trees that were there. It made room for more broadleaf trees to come in, and so therefore it brought in more fall foliage colors later on and created a new interest in the area.
Which is such a perfect segue to our tree group. I'm just going to take advantage of that moment. Holy smokes. All right, tree group, what did you discover?
Well, I can start for us, and then Jennifer, Kevin, you jump right in. We were amazed at how we are living in a parallel world right now. So in 47, how there was such a wet spring, and then it resulted in such a drought, which caused this fire to happen. And what we learned is we kind of went into the origins of the fire from the cranberry bog possibility of it starting from a magnified Coke bottle, and how it started underground. And as an underground fire, it really festered and really kind of caught itself. And then when it reached to the surface, how it was uncontrollable and resulting in this particular area of almost 18,000 acres of being burnt. And we learned that in the past, the majority of the trees were the coniferous ones, the firs and the evergreens, which we know are the sun hogs, and doesn't allow those little deciduous babies to get any type of good sunlight. So with the massive burn, we learned about that it changed the tree growth in the area, and we see the tree growth line is the coloration of the light greens of the deciduous trees coming to the forefront. Jennifer or Kevin, what else would you like to add to that?
I think that was pretty much it. That's a pretty
Okay.
good summary.
Yeah, and we also in our group, we talked a lot about how the rich primary sources we could use, just bringing in the primary sources and having the kids really engage in the primary sources. We know we were doing the research, but it also led to the other instructional pieces that we could connect as a real rich moment. Jennifer, do you want to talk about maybe the writing piece that you saw that could be expanded on this process? And Jennifer, you're on mute, so I saw you just go off. Just mute, so.
Wait a minute. There we go. Am I on now?
Yes, you are. Yep.
Okay. All right. I'm very technologically challenged at times here. I do find that to have the questions, it broadens for the children when they're doing their writing to give them more questions that they can further delve into so that they can expand on their writing. And we've been working a lot with writing with our third graders right now that I'm working with, and it gives them the beginning, the middle, and the end for your conclusion. It gives you so many pieces that they can go with, that they can learn more, because they've got all these different pieces that they're learning. They love to find out new little facts. They love facts, and so I found that to be a big help. So.
And we also, thank you, Jennifer, and we also really connected it to how it impacts today's economy. As you guys kind of talked about, Heather, in your group, is this changed because it changed the landscape and it brought more of those deciduous trees into the mountain area. It is a popular destination we're going into a long weekend, yay for us, and it kind of is a destination for foliage and how it changed the economy to bringing in 2 million a day to our state for the leaf peeping opportunities. And also my last thought for our group is, it was interesting because in our group, we have the diversity of Jennifer, who works with elementary students, and Kevin, who works with high school students. And we could kind of have a conversation and see how this could help with both of those both that continuum of students.
Yeah, and I love all the conversation that was had and all of the research. And so here we have two very different conversations at the beginning. One is about an ecosystem and a biome and what's happening in this picture with the trees. And the other are these human-made structures, but then the stories merge and become the same conversation about place. And there's so many incredible primary sources, and there's so many incredible artifacts you can use. If you were doing this in your classroom, you could have actual leaves or branches, you could have bits of soil. Bogs tend to have a really distinct aroma to them. But one of the most informative classes I ever did was to go out into that cranberry bog and harvest cranberries, and then we made muffins. And there was something while we talked about the fire of 47 and its origin spot, and all the differences. And Tim, I think, no, maybe it was Hamden. Someone was saying that they'd read that the fire cleared the way for Jackson Lab to expand and for the college to exist. And so just, you can also then have this really rich meta conversation about tragedy and opportunity existing in the same space. So that when moments arise that are really difficult to discuss and grapple with, there's that framework of, yes, if we could have avoided this moment, we totally would have. And what will we build out of this moment? And so there are like the really big high concept things and the really granular, how does a fire work? You know, what does it need? Oxygen, fuel, all of these other things. You've got economics with how the region changed. And the thing that I picked up as I was listening in on the tree group and as I was a part of the hotel group was just how much curiosity there is about one question that leads to another question that leads to another question, how cool it was. Like when you guys found the key that actually exists still from the hotel, or I can't believe you found the thread count. That's so awesome. And what does that mean? That luxury used to mean this, which we would now be like, oh no, thank you. I will stay somewhere else. So all of these amazing, rich meta conversations can happen from two very different things that come together and be one. And I know if you stand at this spot and look at the mountains and you realize that you're staring at the fire line, that you can trace where the fire went on this mountain, there's something really powerful about that. And you can hike the fire line. And that's just a really neat moment also. So that takes us to the deeper dive. So here in these two different conversations, you have connections. And I would love to open up the floor to anyone to unmute and talk about how you see these topics connecting with all of the other topics that we get charged with teaching in our schools.
At Hamden, we're looking at one of our courses for juniors and looking at Maine history. And I do have to admit, we just looked at the fire of 47 about a week ago. So there was a little connection there for us.
I love that. I love connections. I love pre-existing knowledge. I love when one thing leads to another. That's awesome.
So we started an initiative last year at our middle school where we consolidated some of our academic teams, but we added on new positions. We have interdisciplinary skills teachers at all 3 grade levels, and we added on a few new allied arts positions, including mine, which is 21st century skills. And this is exactly what both interdisciplinary and kind of I've been doing all along anyway, is trying to integrate all of this into lessons and learning. So this is really cool.
Oh, that makes my heart happy. That's excellent. So the history is obviously right there. You have the whole 47 and the year Maine burned and the way it changed. Oh, and I managed to rate it twice because it's that important. So you've got that. What about numeracy? What are some connections that folks see to numeracy through all of this, which is, you know, mathematics and applied mathematics?
Tracking rainfall and precipitation in the area, being able to look at that and teach children how to use line graphs to be able to plot that data.
You can do something with inflation over time, 1947 costs, 2025 costs.
the
Yeah.
amount of acres, the overall acres of the island, and compared to how much and what percentage burned, looking at all of those numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at, there's this really cool conversation that could be had about how much revenue does the park bring to the overall area and even the overall state? And so what does it mean that we have this amazing national park, and how does that connect to what was going on in 47? You could have all these conversations around that and what it means for our lives, even if you don't live, as some of us are lucky to, right at Acadia's back door. How does it interact with our state's well-being?
Also, I think it could improve, or it could correlate with data sets and connecting data sets with science and seeing, like, for example, the tree population versus the drought conditions and precipitation, as somebody mentioned, but really looking at that data literacy that we often find students need more exposure to.
Absolutely. What about the community and the social aspect? What connections can folks see between this conversation and working on those areas?
During the discussion with the Grand Hotel, some people, I think it was you, Tim, that shared, there were family members. And so that brings the community in there. We also discovered in the fire of 47 that colleges and universities and high schools excused students to go fight the fire. So.
Yeah, was it?
We talked about the connection for our own community in Blue Hill. So I happen to live in a house right now that had the firefighter that was on Blue Hill Mountain on the tower that spotted the Blue Hill fire, and I have the diary in my house that was from the original thing about spotting that fire up there. And so we kind of talked about that and how Blue Hill Mountain had a big part in this with the fire tower at the top.
That is so cool.
Massabesic is made up of 6 different communities. One of them is one of the only towns in Maine that didn't have any fire happen in it. And one was almost completely destroyed by the fire. So that's kind of a cool connection right here in the district.
Yeah, it is. And I heard a lot of conversation too about how it could relate in both groups. I heard the conversation about how it could relate to current events and thinking about the weather pattern that we're currently in and what does that mean, and you know, why we want to respect the burn permit, like ban, not have that brush fire that we might otherwise in the fall. Any other things folks want to add about connections to topics?
I was amazed that there's actually a fictional book about the 1947 fires called "The Stars Are Afire." Talks about people trying to escape the fire, and 2 nonfiction books about the 1947 fires as well for further research.
That's fantastic. Oh, I'm going to have to go look that up. And although as time goes on, this is less and less, there definitely are still elder members of the community who can talk about their own experiences as kids, trying to deal with the fire and get off the island.
And I think another thing, Heather, is the transfer of learning. You're seeing meaning making happening consistently as kids either convert questions into the different types of questions, or as they dive deeper into their own inquiry with the research, have discussions with their classmates about it. You see a transfer of learning and meaning making happening consistently, which we know in neuroscience would say that the learning sticks. So I think that's an important piece of this process as well.
Absolutely. And my hunch is that any kid who had gone through this really playful exploration of the big topics and the science and the history would look at another stand of trees with a different kind of understanding of how to read the landscape that they were looking at and think about, oh, what am I actually seeing here? What's the cue? What am I looking at? Which leads perfectly to the baseball study. And this is where we're going to start to connect what we just did with literacy skills in particular. and the foundational skills of literacy. So I'm guessing some of you already heard about the baseball study. Feel free to drop in the chat or send a little heart emoji if this is one of your favorite things. It's one of my favorite things. And Sam is going to drop a link to the study itself into the chat, and I'll make sure it gets added to the slides that go out. But basically, this was a fairly famous study done in the 80s where they took 3 groups of kids. There were kids who were really strong readers, but didn't really know about baseball, and they put them in one group. And then they took kids who were struggling readers, but who did know a lot about baseball, and put them in another group. And then there were really good readers who knew about baseball, and they put them in the third group. And they gave all of them a passage to read about baseball. And unsurprisingly, the strong readers who knew about baseball did the best, that they had the easiest time. But what shocked everyone at the time, and is maybe less shocking today because we've begun to assimilate this knowledge into the way we work with kids, the strong readers who did not know baseball did way worse than the struggling readers who knew baseball. And that leads to the questions that surround pre-existing knowledge, background knowledge, information that you can lean on as you start to make meaning. And so if you had a kid who came into a reading assignment with a lot of knowledge about the subject matter that you were going to cover, they would have an easier time making sense and making meaning, and they would emerge as a stronger reader, which leads to when we talk about how to work on bolstering literacy skills and helping all readers become proficient, leaning into areas of strength and building that background knowledge. How do we make sure that we are providing information that they want to read and information that their brains can connect with and make sense of? And I'm going to pause for any thoughts or questions or add-ons about that.
I will add on because I have noticed I teach 5th grade, and I noticed that there's a lot of students that I teach that don't have a lot of background knowledge in subjects that I thought they already did. That there's a real lack with the generation right now because I believe because of social media and sort of living a sheltered life and just being able to always follow on social media what's popular or what their interests are. So the last year or two, I've really been using different websites that help build background knowledge on just topics, just like an article a day type thing at ReadWorks or something to be able to really supplement within them. And from what I've learned for the research is that that's like a huge pillar of literacy is background knowledge and being able to have that connection. And so if we're not building that background knowledge, and a lot of children are not able, they don't have shared content. And so without the lack of shared content, how can we be able to supplement some of the things that we think, oh, of course they know about that. Well, they don't, and so that's something that I've been thinking a lot about too.
Yeah, and I think that we are beginning to understand in even more profound ways the role that it really plays in the foundational understanding of the text really leads to the ability to even decode the text. You could quite easily run into a situation where a learner is able to sound out a word, but if they don't understand what that word means, then the reading in the most true sense is lost because you don't have it. And we were playing around with this idea, and there's the classic One Morning in Maine, with the plunk, plunk, plunk of the blueberries. And if you've never gone blueberry harvesting with a pail, there were some questions about, wait, why the plunk, plunk, plunk? And kids who had come from other countries that were really arid and flat and not with mountains were like, it was a complete, wait, no, stop. What is happening? Whereas kids who had grown up in coastal Maine were like, well, it's blueberry picking. And so that was a moment in my teaching career. I was like, yes, oh my goodness, this really basic children's book, not a complicated text at all, made no sense whatsoever to an entire group of kids because the background knowledge was lost. And so when we think about building literacy skills, those things are really important, which is where teaching with primary sources and tactile and asking questions starts to really build that and strengthen the skills that are needed for literacy. So we're going to look specifically at the literacy interweave. So the 5 big ideas of literacy are phonemic awareness, which is identify and play with the individual sounds and spoken words. The phonics, reading instruction on understanding how letters and groups of letters link to sounds to form letter-sound relationships. Fluency, being able to read with speed and expression correctly. Vocabulary, of course, knowing what words mean. And this is another area where science is starting to realize that there's a huge gap emerging in vocabulary between students who have a lot of exposure to different ideas and students who do not. And of course, comprehension, the ability to understand what you are reading. And Kathy, do you want to jump in and talk some more about the explicit connection between project-based and questions and the 5 big ideas?
Sure. So what we're realizing is that these big ideas can be scaffolded into the project-based learning. And what we are being able to really suss out, for example, in vocabulary, is that we can address tier 1 in the project-based, but we also, through this type of the QFT process, we expose students to that tier 2, that discipline-specific vocabulary, and to tier 3 about meaning making with that discipline specific vocabulary. Also, we are able to connect with the visualization. So it's almost like a dual coding when they are looking at primary sources. Students are able to look at the visual and connect it to the word. So again, that meaning making. So those are just a couple of just quick hits on how this project-based learning really does address literacy, and it can be scaffolded to meet your students' needs.
And so now I really want to open it up for some reflection on your own experiences with the project that we just went through, with the question formulation technique, and with the ideas of how to link it to literacy. And it can be thoughts that you've had or questions that you've had or moments of, I'm not quite sure I see the link. Any and all of that is welcome. And I open up the floor.
So I guess I've been doing this kind of stuff more often than I realized, or without giving it any name, but I think I got inspired. Was it Joe Smith that was with the DOE for a while, the history department? So he had come here years ago and done a day of PD with us, and he did something very similar. We were looking at historic photos and, okay, what observations do you see? What questions do you have? What do you need to know to be able to identify this photo? And that just really struck me. And I've been doing that type of thing with my history classes, and I've been doing it this year with my 21st century skills classes too, tying it into asking the right questions to be a critical thinker and a problem solver. So yeah, this is awesome. It's fun for one thing. That I think the kids just really enjoy doing it, and I like it too. So it's win-win.
Yeah, I
And-
agree. It reminds me of the document-based questions, like in social studies, DBQ. And I think it's great. And, I think the difference there is that we're looking more in social studies at the sources in the year. And here it's a little bit more, you're thinking more analytically or being able to like expand more on it. What do you see? Where is that going to lead you? You're allowed to go down that rabbit hole and how, I like that.
Well, we were just talking about pre-existing knowledge and how that contributes to literacy. And one of the images I use is a picture of the construction of Disneyland in California. And looking at it, you wouldn't know that it was Disneyland unless maybe you've been there. But there's all sorts of clues as to what's going on. There's 2 vehicles. One of them is a Jeep. So, okay, if you don't know that Jeeps were first invented in the 40s, or if you do know that, then you have a rough time frame of when this picture is. And there's everything is under construction, and how wide is the gauge on those rails, and so some kids have got a lot of pre-existing knowledge and it helps them, and others don't. But it's
So I'm going to just jump in. Do you folks see when you're working with, because we recognize that each classroom has a variation of student level and readiness, right? Do you see when you use some sort of cue focus or picture that it kind of lessens the cognitive load for some of your students and they're more motivated or they're more engaged in the conversation or the research? Because that's what we are seeing, that this type of instructional approach kind of almost lessens that cognitive load, and students are much more motivated to engage in because they're using that visual as their orientation point of entry. Is anybody seeing that with some of this practice in their classroom?
yeah, I would absolutely say so.
Okay.
I'm explicitly teaching Maine history this year with a really strong focus on the state. And it's interesting to see the kids make the connections between place and thing and event. And you talk about Maine becoming a state and the signing of the charter in 1820 in Freeport. And then they're like, oh, I've been to Freeport. I didn't realize. So it's not necessarily an image, but using the places that they know or they've been, and they don't realize the connections that to bring together.
And what
We were
about,
talking about
I'm
that
sorry.
too, about how, for us, we have a lot of curriculums in elementary school that might use stories from other places. And it's good to build the knowledge, but they don't really have the background knowledge to understand what it would be like to be, or to even know what migrant workers in a farm field are, or some of the Latino culture of the West. And to be able to really be able to also, we were talking to supplement in, like, we also need books on lobstering. We're on the coast. We need books about, blueberries and potatoes and all those other things too, to really build up. And I was just last week was doing the Southwest with the kids in social studies, and they had no idea what a mesa was. And so if I didn't be able to bring up some pictures of some of these things, I mean, especially in elementary school, pictures are really, really key to anchor kids and to be able to build conceptual knowledge. So I think this is a great starting point to start some of those conversations with a picture.
And my other question would be, do you see it helping to increase a reading stamina? So we, see kids that maybe are disconnected with the written word, and this is a way the project base or the QFT allows for kids to build their reading muscle, their reading stamina. I'd love if anybody had some insight or some experience with that, where they see reading stamina, what about accessibility, where you're able to include such a diverse population of kids into a conversation? Love to get some insight on that as well, if anybody has some reflective pieces on that.
I'm going to chime in with what I saw in the group, which is that, admittedly, educators, but I was amazed that instead of taking the break, you guys used the break time to actually start the research, because the curiosity was piqued. And that's like such a perfect encapsulation of one of the things that I love the most about this, is that there is that sense of, no, let me go chase that down. I really want to know more about that. So that's neat. And another thing that I have found in my teaching that works so beautifully with this is it gives struggling readers permission to struggle with a word. It's not a text that, sometimes when you're reading a book and there's a word and you feel like you should know it. One of the things about this kind of inquiry is you can say, yeah, we're going to be coming across some really crazy research words, and we will need to keep track of the ones that we don't understand, that we need to know more about. And so it gives that sense of, okay, everyone is figuring this out because this is research, and that's a different thing than struggle. And it also at the same time allows students who are really good at one thing. So I would find that my students who spend a lot of time in the woods hunting had a really different skill set and knowledge base than the students who spent a lot of time in the library, or the students who spent a lot of time playing baseball had a different sense of something. There's just different competencies and different knowledges, and this gives you space to recognize all of them as valuable and to say, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you were here because you understand how that works. Can you please explain it to the rest of us? That's fantastic. And so all learners get to be part of the learning community. And I just think that's really magical.
I was going to mention, I loved what when you did the baseball study.
Oh, Kevin, I can see you, but I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
You can.
Okay. So in the baseball study, it's really comparative to AP testing. And I've been to a lot of college boards weeks, and it used to be a grader. But you look at tests like the APUSH test, and almost no kids in school love history. They like history, maybe they've had a good teacher, whatever, but it's not their passion. But kids that want to be engineers, like the AP calculus test for them is easy. That's why the APUSH test is one of the hardest tests, because generally kids don't have that passion for it. So like in the baseball study, you get the passion plus the knowledge, and they just kill it. But if you have passion but not the knowledge, you can really struggle. And that's why there's sometimes great students who take AP tests in a subject that's not their main subject, and they get 2s and 1s because it's not their thing. And I had never seen that baseball study before, but that makes perfect sense because we talk about it at the college board meetings all the time. That was perfect.
I had I am a reader. I became a librarian. Books are my thing, and I had a wonderful educator hand me a 5-page pamphlet on undersea drilling apparatus. I struggled with every single paragraph. And she said, you know, of course, because you don't know it. And these words are really hard for you. And this is what it's like when you're handed something that is in a different medium. And it was such a nice, well, no, it was an awful experience to struggle with the text, but it was good for me to struggle with the text. And it really drove home, though, when you are in your own space. It also drove home the scaffolding, because she came back to the drilling thing and she then brought up pictures and she then brought up explanatory text, and she gave grace to not understand it. And so that meant that we could, I mean, none of us needed to know the underwater drilling, but we did actually learn it by the end, because there was all the support and all of the room to ask questions and all of the space to not know the answer and the space to not understand what we were doing without judgment. And all of that felt really meaningful, and is a part of why I love project-based learning, because it creates those moments in such a strong way. Are there other moments that folks have connected up with literacy skills in particular, the vocab or the phonemic awareness? I love it for the vocab, because you stumble upon these words that you would never get in any other word list sort of situation, that let you really play with the bigger concepts of how to tackle words that are new to you. And you also get to reenact some crazy questions, like when the hotel group, when you were chasing down a whole bunch of questions down rabbit holes, and you were finding a whole bunch of different information all about the way that the community functioned and who was it named after and what color was the hotel. Those were fantastic research skills that you weren't necessarily sent off to find. And I have to ask, what color was the hotel? What did you discover?
We discovered that it was a brick color, kind of a pale red.
Interesting. And in my brain, all this time, it's been natural shingles with green trim, and I've been wrong all this time. And I realized I created that completely in my own head. Are there any other experiences that folks have had with project-based learning or with the question formulation technique? I'll circle back to that a little more specifically. I'm going to hone in on the QFT for a moment because I absolutely love it. There are several different ways of generating conversation with kids that I love. I love the Socratic method, which is really different from the QFT, because in Socratic, you are asking the questions of students and generating a conversation around that. But the QFT I find particularly useful because it has such a rigid structure, which is usually something that I shy away from. But this rigid structure gives students such a place to experiment within. There was a study in New York City back in the 70s. They found at the school playground that kids were always right up against the playground fence, and they were like pushing on it and leaning on it and trying to go further. And so they thought, let's take away the fence and let them explore. So they took down the fence and the kids were right up against the building, terrified to explore the rest of the yard. They stuck right up against. So they put the fence back and the kids were right up against the fence, pushing and exploring the whole yard. And that's sort of how I feel about the QFT, that it creates this boundary of, instead of asking a good question, the charge is to ask as many questions as you can in the time that you have. So you are freed up to explore and throw out everything that crosses your mind, and you don't have to worry about it sounding smart or it being correct, because your goal is to create volume. And then you start to work on them. And then you do this really cool thing where you examine what kind of question are you asking and why are you asking that kind of question? And what is it you really need to know? Do you need a quick hit of information and then move on? Or do you need to understand something a little bit more fully and in depth? And because there are some students who are out there who are really good with the quick answer, they have their moment, and the students who really want to think something through or talk it through, they have their moment. And then you get to do the research. And again, I feel so badly that we condensed it, because part of the joy is bringing in the things that people can touch and can really examine with their hands, and then spend a lot of time finding what sources you want to give you the answers that you want. And when you start doing sourcing, that's where you can start working with kids on vetting their sources. And how do you know that you can trust something? And it's always fun in those moments to throw in one or two bad sources and let them trip over that. So for example, one February, we were doing biographies of people of color who had changed the way that our world worked. And rather than the folks that typically come up when you're studying, we were really looking at some of the untold stories that were still really big. And one of the people we were looking at is the man who invented the refrigerated truck, which means that we can have fresh vegetables in the winter, even though they're not growing here, because other places can ship them to us with refrigeration. And I had photocopied articles about this man's life and given it to groups. And there were 3 different articles. And I'd highlighted the parts that I needed them to pay attention to so they could find them really easily. And we started by talking about, what do you need to know in a biography? And we were going through, and I asked them for the critical information. I said, so we need his name. What's his name? And they gave me his name. And I said, great. Okay. Now, what year was he born? And they gave me the year of birth. And I started writing, and I started to move to the next question. And then one group said, no, wait, hang on, time out. I have a completely different year. And so then we got to stop everything and unpack. And there were different years and different places of birth, which allowed us to talk about, why would that be the case? Why is it that someone born in the 1800s might have different years recorded for their birth? But it also really drove home, if you had only looked at one article, you would think you knew, as opposed to 3 articles where you found that there was different information. And that was a really powerful in the moment kind of thing, which you can again do with this kind of project-based learning, where you can really dig into, how are you sourcing, how are you getting the information? So that's kind of fun too. And here at the interdisciplinary instruction team, I want to make sure that everyone knows about some things coming up if you want to go a little bit further. We have a homepage where there's a lot of information and it changes fairly regularly. There's the professional learning schedule for more conversations. And we have a newsletter, which I would encourage everyone to sign up for because that's where we send out all the tidbits, and it's not too much, it's not overwhelming. There are also some brand new hubs that are created and being created even as we speak. So there's the STEAM Hub, Numeracy, Civics, Literacy, and Arts and Humanities. And that is a really lovely collective of information from all across the Department of Education of things that are happening and emerging knowledge. We also have a whole bunch of things coming up on the Engine website. So I'm hoping everyone knows about Engine, but if not, it is sometimes asynchronous recorded modules and sometimes virtual learning experiences that are free to all Maine educators, and they're exceptional, if I do say so myself. We have one on the question formulation technique, which is going to open again in October. Modern literacies, which is really similar, Tim, to what you teach on the daily. So I would love to connect with you on that. Teaching with transfer, student-centered learning, human-centered learning, and concept-based instruction. There is, of course, the Find Us Online. And in the time that we have remaining, I would ask each of you to use this QR code to fill in the feedback form for this session. And as you do so, I want to thank you very much for joining. The next session, if you are signed up for it, begins at 12:30. And I'm hoping that some folks are going to come to the graphic novel one for literacy that I am hosting. If you're not, let me dangle that as something you might want to sign up for. And as you fill in the feedback, I will open it up for any additional questions or thoughts or comments or requests that are out there.